We are starting with our California Young Reader nominees. And this next week will be the first one. And this book is for our 4th, 5th, and 6th graders. After we read all 3 of the books, then you can vote of your favorite book. The title of the first book is Step Right Up, How Doc and Jim Key Taught the World About Kindness. Here's our dedication page. He dedicated to his mother, who shared her love of horses with me, he said, and to Christy, the greatest art teacher ever. Spring of 1889 stretched a blanket of wild flowers over Shelbyville, Tennessee, but William Doc Key barely noticed. He paced and fidgeted like an expectant father. He had been on hand for plenty of births before, but this one was special. Visions of a future champion racehorse darted through his mind as he comforted his mare, Loretta. Finally, a dark, wet colt lay shivering at her side. Doc knelt to welcome the little fellow, but something was terribly wrong. "He's the most spindly, shank-legged animal I ever did see," he said. Most folks would have given up on that colt right then, but Doc had a kind streak that ran clear through his heart and all the way back to his childhood. William Key was born into slavery in 1833. As a child in Shelbyville, he was full of questions about the world. In some parts of the United States, educating an enslaved person was a crime. Even where it was forbidden, many owners did not want their enslaved people to be educated. But John and Martha Key, William's master, like several others in Shelbyville, thought differently. So the Keys allowed William to join their sons for lessons. Learning gave William a sense of freedom. From the time William was about 6 years old, it was clear he had a special way with animals. No matter how wild or rascally the animals, William befriended them and tamed them. He especially loved horses. A few years later, William's masters started sending him across Bedford County to work with other farmers' ornery animals. During these travels, William saw how some animals were neglected, beaten, and worked to death. He was gentle and patient with them instead. He thought nothing was worse than being hurtful. William learned all he could about caring for the injuries and the illnesses of the animals and people. He paid special attention when his mother taught him how to distill roots and herbs into homemade remedies. As William worked at different farms and businesses, his doctoring skills developed and his reputation grew across Tennessee. By the time he was a young man, William was so good at treating injuries and ailments that everyone started calling him Doc Key, or just Doc. In 1865, the Civil War ended, and Doc built a new life as a free man. He married and bought his first patch of land in Shelbyville. It was the perfect spot to build his new horse hospital. Doc also perfected his own line of medicines, including Keystone liniment, which could be used to treat both horses and people. Well, after the war, many formerly enslaved people faced racism and prejudice from white people who would not recognize them as equals. Doc decided the best way to beat the prejudice that he encountered was to try and make friends with everyone and show them he could be a successful businessman. He eventually opened a blacksmith shop, a wagon wheel and harness making shop, a restaurant, and a hotel. He even built a racetrack and dreamed of racing fine racehorses of his own. Doc's Keystone liniment became so popular that he bought a medicine wagon, hired entertainers, and hit the road. He sold his medicines in towns across the South. Soon Doc was one of the wealthiest men in Shelbyville. One day, as Doc and his wagon clattered through a dusty town, he heard about a run-down circus in Tupelo, Mississippi, that was trying to sell its horses. As he neared the ragtag circus, Doc spotted a scraggly gray mare. She looked neglected and abused. She walked with a limp. Despite her sad condition, Doc recognized that the mare was a purebred Arabian, a horse bred prized for its intelligence and its speed. Doc bought the horse, named Loretta, for $40 and welcomed her into his family. Doc lovingly nursed Loretta back to health. When she was strong again, he paired her with one of the fastest racing stallions in the country. Doc hoped that their offspring would grow up to be a champion racehorse. But on that spring day in 1889, the sight of the sickly colt almost broke Doc's heart. In an instant, Doc's racing dreams for the newborn horse vanished. For weeks, the young horse could barely walk. Friends urged Doc to put the colt out of his misery, but Doc wouldn't listen. Just as he had nursed Loretta back to health, Doc vowed to help her colt. He dished out just the right food and medicines. He massaged the colt's knobby legs, groomed his scraggly coat, and mulled over the perfect name to give him. The biblical name Doc had chosen for a racehorse. The biblical name Doc had chosen for a racehorse didn't fit the wobbly youngster, so Doc just called him Jim Key. Well, Uncle Doc's care, Jim's health improved, and his curiosity grew. Jim seemed to study Doc's every move, even when Doc played with his dog. Then one day, Jim zigzagged over with a stick dangling from his mouth. Doc laughed and tossed the stick away. Jim stumbled after it like a clumsy dog. He was a knowing colt, I tell you, Doc said. He showed me he could fetch and proceeded to try to do the other tricks the dog could do. Jim learned to sit, play dead, act sick, and roll over on cue. When Jim was about a year old, Loretta died. Well, Doc, he was heartbroken, but he also worried about Jim. The old orphaned colt needed looking after night and day. So Doc, he coaxed him up the porch steps and through the front door of his house. The young horse made himself right at home. When Doc counted money, Jim watched. When Doc wrote letters, Jim watched. When Doc opened and closed drawers, Jim watched. Pretty soon he began to pick at me, trying to imitate me, Doc said. In time, Jim's legs straightened and he muscled up. He grew into a handsome young stallion and too big for the house. Well, Doc knew it was time for his four-legged horse house guest to move back to the stable. But Jim kicked up a mighty ruckus until Doc started sleeping on a cot next to Jim's stall. Then Doc moved in his desk and most of his office. Before long, he was practically living in the stable with Jim. When Doc was ready to hitch up the medicine wagon again, he decided to bring Jim along as his newest attraction. Doc held up a bottle of Keystone liniment and announced for people to gather around. He told the crowd how his sickly, crippled colt had grown strong and healthy. Right on cue, Jim pretended to be sick. He limped and drooped and snorted and wobbled. Then Doc gave Jim a spoonful of medicine and massaged a dollop of liniment into his legs. Suddenly Jim acted well again. He pranced around, frisky as a pup. The audience clapped and laughed and lined up to buy Doc's medicine. Back at home one day, Doc's wife walked into the stable, munching on a snack. "Jim, do you want a piece of apple?" she asked. Jim nodded his head up and down. Mrs. Key ran back to the house calling, "Doctor, doctor, the horse can say yes." Doc began to wonder what else his horse could learn. Well, the stable was transformed into a horse-sized classroom. Doc painted sugar on a cardboard square marked with the letter A and held it up to Jim. "A, A, A," Doc said. Jim swiveled his ears and listened. Then he licked the card until it was soggy. Doc created a new card out of tin. Every day he patiently repeated, "A, A, A," as he slipped the card between Jim's lips. For weeks, Jim just licked the sugar and stared blankly at his teacher. Doc sighed and shook his head, but he kept at it. After 6 months, Jim finally understood. If Doc called for the letter A, Jim grabbed the right card and dropped it into Doc's hand. In no time, Jim learned to fetch the B card and then the C card and then all the way to Z. Doc was proud. He rewarded Jim with an apple or a sugar cube for each correct answer. Next, Doc had Jim combine letters to spell words, choose numbers, to make sums, find flags, to identify states, move clock hands to tell time, and a whole lot more. When it was time for Jim to learn to write, Doc painted Jim's name with sugar on a blackboard. It took months for the horse to learn to lick the pattern of his name. Then Doc slipped some chalk between Jim's teeth so the horse could write his name. The chalk crumbled. They needed a bigger piece. 7 years passed quickly in Jim's private classroom. The more kindness Doc heaped on Jim, the more willing the horse was to learn. Doc was now ready to show the world what Jim could do.